Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to Edible Evanston and the Evanston Public Library's presentation of Getting Ready to Garden Next Spring. And when I prepared the title, I really meant next spring because, as Tim and I will tell you, fall is a great time to start gardening. And since soil is so important for growing things well, we're going to be talking a lot about soil and other ways that you can get started next spring. This is just a slide that will show you some of the topics that we will be covering, and I will be sending this to you after the class, so you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. And we also will be recording this and putting this on the YouTube channel for the library. My name is Julie Rand. I'm a librarian and also a master gardener, and I've been at the library for 4 years. And our speaker for this evening is Tim Sonder, who's representing Edible Evanston. And Tim, could you tell people a little bit about yourself?
I am an avid gardener. I've never gotten any official training, but it's really what my life is centered on. And I've been vegetable gardening for, well, a little bit as a child, spent a little bit of time on a farm as a child, and but grew up in New York City. And so I sort of have had the very urban experience growing up. And I've been vegetable gardening for probably about 35, 40 years, and am very involved in Edible Evanston, as Julie mentioned, which I'll discuss later.
So I just sent a little note to everyone. If those of you who are not presenting, which means Tim, if you can please turn off your videos and also mute yourself. That makes it a little less distracting for Tim and I, since we're going to be talking. That would be very helpful. Thank you. Tim, should we take it away? So tonight we're going to be covering some of these topics. One of them, of course, a very important one is expectations. I've been gardening for 30 years, and you can't always get exactly what you hope to right off the bat. But Tim is going to go over why expectations, in other words, your mindset, are important when you start gardening. Take it away, Tim.
Yeah, I think the thing that I wanted to emphasize is the journey of gardening and the fact that that can be a joy. So even if you don't end up getting a food yield in your first year, or not everything works, that's okay. Just embrace the experience. And like much in life, it comes with some good and bad. So, watch little plants emerging from seeds, which is a miracle. The water drops sitting on leaves, flowers opening. The miracle of life in the soil. It's just like there's a lot to look at and connect with the earth, and I hope it'll sort of open up your thinking. And remember that all of us have trouble with various things from year to year. If you talk to gardeners, they'll say, oh, this year, everybody was complaining about their cucumber yield. I did okay, but some people just failed when last year might have been an ideal cucumber year. So don't blame yourself. Remember that there's weather, there are pests, there are other things, and that's okay. Not everything will succeed this year. Next year will be different, and different is not always better, but that's okay. Again, just sort of go for the ride and remember that that your yield is more than the food you're putting on your family's plate. I think that's really what I want to say. Julie, got anything more to add?
Well, I was going to say that when Tim and I were talking about this, that whole concept of grounding, if you think about it, being grounded is in touch with the ground. And I can speak for myself. This year with COVID, I spent a lot of time in the garden, and I found it very very calming. So it's good for the spirit, even if you don't get perfect tomatoes.
Yeah, it's sort of can be a meditation. And the thing I always find when I'm in the garden is, for better or worse, I lose track of time. And that's a really good thing if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So enjoy it. You've got to figure out where you're going to do this if you're gardening for the first time, or if you're thinking about expanding your gardening. And I'm a firm believer in permaculture, and permaculture's principle one is observe and interact.
Tim, what's permaculture?
Oh, well, permaculture.
A short definition.
Permaculture is, could be considered a philosophy, but it's really a design framework. It's a way of looking at the world through the eyes of ecosystems and nature and how it all interacts. The first thing you should know is above the principles, and there are 12 of them at this point, are the 3 ethics, which are earth care, people care, and fair share. So caring for the earth, caring for each other in the community, and sharing with all life forms as you work. So that kind of frames the whole point of the thing, but then the principles tend to make you look at your space and materials and your life and the economy and the world, however you want to, however you want to apply it, and I'm serious there, with a certain way of understanding a whole.
Okay. Well, how does it apply to picking your garden space?
Well, the point of observe and interact is it's a good idea to get to know your potential spaces and really look at them and understand them from all sorts of points of view, and don't just have the picture that you have in your mind of that space, but really get out there and figure out things like, where does the wind come from? How much rain falls here? How is the water moving across the landscape? And very importantly, how does the sun move across the landscape? Do you have a lot of children running through the space? Do you have a lot of dogs running through the space? Do you have a lot of rabbits running through the space? Get out there and really look at it and figure out, do you have a lot of cars splashing stuff along the space? I mean, it's really everything. It's not just the natural forces, it's the human forces as well. Mm-hmm. So get yourself involved and look carefully. And one of the reasons to start now, and in some ways, you can never start early enough. But one of the reasons to start now is, as we'll talk about sunshine and other factors, that will all be changing in the weeks to come. And if you try and plan your garden in January, when there's snow on the ground and the day length is different, you'll have much more trouble doing it than if you really start looking at least now.
Okay.
So where do you have space? Do study the sunlight, that's critical. How much space do you want now? And do you want to think about the future at this point? What about water? What about any rules and regulations? So looking into your options, definitely consider your lawn. For some reason, we seem to reserve the sunniest, best spot for our lawn often, because like lots of other things, grass won't grow well in the shade. But do you really need all your lawn? Do you need a lawn at all? Does it have the best sun? What are the competing uses? You'll see some photos coming up of an area of my lawn that I was finally able to take over for a higher use. My kids are grown up. They don't need it as a soccer field anymore. But it would have been a problem for me probably when they were living at home and younger, and we would have had a conflict. So be realistic about your other needs. Do you have no lawn? Can you only use a paved area? Do you have a patio, a balcony, a bit of non-public way sidewalk? Do you have a driveway that you don't actually use for cars? Do you have an existing flower bed that you're willing to sacrifice some of? Do you have, like pictured here, a little edge of alley space that is not really public way that you can use? Can you take over your parkway? That has its challenges, but often has good sunlight again. So I just want to point out in this photo as we go forward that, so this is tucked into a fence along an alley, and it's kind of made with recycled found materials. So things can be done cheap and fit in niches that you might not even realize you have. And then there's the question of light. We'll get into the path of the sun during the year and how that changes and how objects cast shade, but it's really important that if you do the observe and interact, that you don't do it just at noon, that you get out and see what things are like at, well, right now, maybe 8:30 or 9 in the morning, again at noon, and late in the afternoon. Figure out what areas are getting sunshine and what have shade, and realize that the sun right now is moving further and further to the south, and the angles are different now than they are in midsummer. If you find you have too much shade for some things, you may be able to grow other things. So it's, again, set your expectations properly. So if you don't really have enough sunlight, grow some greens and other things that will do well in those conditions, and either find a little niche somewhere that's sunny and grow some tomatoes in a pot, or don't try and do it and set yourself up for failure. So be realistic as well.
Yeah, believe it or not, I've had some luck growing some herbs, in a little bit shadier spot too. Like I successfully grew dill next to my kale this summer.
I was going to include herbs on the list, and you would think that they don't do so well because they like a sunny Mediterranean climate for the most part, but a lot of things you can get away with, yes. And especially if you're growing from seed and you have the space, if you're not using it for something else, try something, take a chance. It's okay to experiment. It's okay to fail. So these are a little complicated. So if you're into technical things, there are technical tools available. If you're into making sketches, you could do that instead. But this is actually, I've got a couple of things, there's some tools out there. There's a couple of things, if you happen to know Evanston's latitude and longitude, you would see that those have been entered here, because if you are on the equator, your curve is different than if you're in the Arctic. So these are accurate for here and show the path of the sun at different seasons of the year and different times of the day and the angles it goes. And so they can help guide you as to where shade is. And there's a lot of those different curves. The University of Oregon has a website that can generate this curve, but I can share that you see in the lower left. That's very specific for here and relatively easy to, for these things, relatively easy to read. But the basic concepts are shown in these two different illustrations, where the angle of the sun is going to be different in the winter than in the summer. And some areas in your yard will get no shade. Other areas will get shade in the morning, but not in the afternoon, and vice versa. Think about what objects might cause shade. If you plant close to a fence, as you see here, you'll see that the fence, if the fence is oriented north-south, it's going to cast shade at some time during the day. So figure out your orientation of everything. Evanston is very nicely gridded out so that most of us can very easily tell where north is, and therefore where east and west and south, for that matter, are, which will be useful in figuring out the path during the day. But the most basic way is, of course, the observe and interact. Go out there and look at it. But remember that seasonally it will change.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that your neighbor's property might cast shade too. My neighbor's garage causes me some shade in the afternoon, so I have to kind of squeeze in my tomatoes so they get enough sun.
Well, and I'll mention permaculture principle number 12, which is creatively use and respond to change. So my neighbor had an ash tree that was pretty small when I started gardening, got kind of big and was causing a little bit of a problem. And ComEd came and took care of a tiny bit of it because it was in the power line. But it stayed around until this year when I got new neighbors and they cut it down. So now all of a sudden I have sun again. Another factor that I didn't mention about seasonality, which is really critical, is leaves. So I'm sitting here at my office, and I'll show you some pictures of that, where of course I garden because I can't help myself anywhere I am. In the spring, I do pretty well at getting greens started. I get great lettuce and everything. And then the huge elm trees across the street finish leafing out fully, and I get a lot more shade through the rest of the summer. And now about this week, all of a sudden, I'm getting sun again. So if you look now, you may get fooled by the fact that the trees are losing their leaves and some of that shade is going. So try and remember, look through your photos, whatever you can do to figure out where your sun is in midsummer.
Yeah, and also some trees have denser canopies, of leaves than others too.
Very much so, very much so. So, how much space do you want? Think about that. How much can you really manage initially? How much time do you want to take care of it? How much are you trying to grow right now? I suggest not starting with less than about a 4x8 area. It doesn't have to be one area, it could be 2 4x4s. But I also suggest leaving room for expansion or thinking about that if you have the space. If you don't have the space, you can really still grow quite a bit out of that. We were planning to do a little bit of an experiment with Edible Evanston this year and actually weigh and measure the harvest from 2 4x4 beds. But with this year's little challenges, that we grew, but that part fell by the wayside. Consider your access to water and how much you're willing to deal with the hassle of it. This year was incredible. We had a very wet time, which we've all forgotten, in the first half of the summer, spring and summer, and then we had nothing. And the need to water was constant. So figure out if you've got access to city water, if you can set up rain barrels, if you're willing to carry buckets. But keep that in mind. Don't plant a garden where you can't water it. I think the only, unless you guys want to build hoop houses and things, I think the only regulations you have to worry about right now from the city are regarding parkways. Officially, as you will see, some of us don't quite toe that line. Please don't tell. There's a 3-foot height limit for plants on parkways, which still means you can grow a lot of different vegetables. And officially, you're not allowed to put a raised bed structure in place, but that doesn't really mean you can't garden, although a raised bed structure does have some benefits on the parkway of separating. There's some ideas for using like an edge of small boulders or something, some way to separate it out, especially from dogs, to be honest. They're the biggest problem. All right. So, do you need a raised bed? Julie, do you need a raised bed?
Well, I do. I like Tim, my kids, as they grew up, things changed. So I put a raised bed in an area that had a climbing structure for my kids, but it was near my 100-plus-year-old garage, and we discovered it had lead paint. So I did not want to grow edibles in soil, native soil that was near lead paint. So I opted to put the raised bed away from the garage, and I got all new soil because I didn't want to worry about lead being in my food. So you do have to keep that in mind.
And that is one of the things on my pros list. So yes, definitely. And actually I had built a fort with my kids, and I had sunk some 4x4s with concrete into the ground for this big play structure that we made. And I ended up taking the floor out of the play structure, cutting the 4x4s down a bit, but leaving it as a frame for trellising, and putting sides on the bottom, and that is now one of my raised beds. So I took the floor apart and made it into the sides of the bottom. And I'm saying that now because of one of the things on here is cost, and I pointed out the little raised bed I had in the alley. You can find materials, and especially if you, don't use just anything. It should be food safe, obviously, but there's lots of ways of making things for yourself, which don't necessarily require new lumber. But pros, raised beds drain better, and they warm up faster. So the drain better relates to areas that have flooding. Now, Evanston has 2 main types of soil. If you live in the Ridge Asbury area, for the most part, it doesn't quite follow the streets, but if you live in that area, you are on an old, not sand dune, sandbar from Lake Chicago, from when Lake Michigan was a whole lot bigger, and it was called Lake Chicago. So that area is raised and sandy and drains pretty fast. And the rest of Evanston is clay. And it is quite different. So water tends to pool, and it can be hard to start a garden in the spring because the ground is so saturated. So some areas you're going to get a different advantage. So that's why I have the drains on here. Looks neater. So if you've got an aesthetic concern, if you're worried about what your neighbors might think, it could look neater, but that's in the eye of the beholder to some extent and depends on how you garden.
Ken, we did have a question. Tori wanted to know what the boundaries of the area are of the sandbar, like what would be the eastern and the western boundaries, presumably.
Well, I believe it drops off pretty quickly from ridge. So there was, it was kind of it was one kind of swampy area toward the lake, and it was a different kind of swampy area in the other direction. And it varies a bit because of course ridge goes through as an angled street. And like in my couple of locations along Wesley, it's definitely still sand, although it's really interesting up when you get to Ashland, like around Ashland and Emerson, that's already all clay.
And one way you can tell is obviously if you pour water into the ground and it goes through quickly, it's sandy. But another way you can tell if you have clay soil is if you pick up a ball of soil, it should be somewhat damp, and squeeze it. And if it holds the ball shape, it's more likely to have a lot more clay in it. And clay just doesn't drain as well because the particles are so much smaller. So they don't get as much oxygen and it can't drain as well. So you can always do the ball test to see, because that's going to be more accurate than saying, oh, my address is blah, blah, blah.
The other way to do a test of that type of thing is to dig out, remove just the top inch and a half, take the next couple of inches to 6 inches of soil, put it in a jar, add water, shake it up, and let it sit. And you will see it'll separate out into its layers from the water. And you can see a sandy layer and a silty layer and a clay layer. And you can look that up online and it will help you figure out how to analyze the mineral components and it's a way of also calculating the amount of organic matter you've got. But like I'll talk about the edible Evanston food forest later, which is up along McCormick across Bridge Street. And when we're digging in there, there's no question it's clay. It's like you can often get, once you get beneath the topsoil especially, you can get a gray, I mean, you'd look at it and you'd say, oh, I can make pottery. No, I'm perfectly serious. It is,
I get it.
It is pure pottery clay in there. So everything, there's some gradients between that, but yes. So deters critters and dogs a bit. So don't count on keeping anything out just from a raised bed, but it does help. As Julie pointed out, if you either suspect or know you have contaminated soil beneath, a raised bed is a good idea. Containers may be even a better idea, but if you use a raised bed and if you know you have them, it's the one time I would change my rule against landscape fabric. Go ahead and put landscape fabric at the bottom of it to separate it so that the ground soil doesn't end up mixing with the soil that you have, that you're adding, to keep it purer. It also, I'll get into that a little later, but I'll say, even if you have a contamination problem and if you do that, if you make sure you've got good soil and separate it, and then if you choose to grow depends on the things you grow. I'll just say whether or not you're worried about, like fruiting things tend not to have a problem. Leafy greens more so. Part of it is splashing of soil. Another pro can be for people who are less physically able. There can be less bending, although that tends to mean you've got to build a double high bed to really get anything out of it, or a double high bed with a seat or a seat, and it's more material, more soil, more work. So the cons. If it drained better and warms up faster, gee, it dries out faster and it cools down faster. So there's a trade-off there. Surprisingly, the area right around where the wood, assuming it's wood, where the wood meets the soil can be a great home for slugs that can cause problems. So you can encourage them there. I already mentioned the extra expenses, and sometimes if your soil on your property is perfectly good, it's hard to source enough good soil to fill a raised bed. It takes time to turn that into really good soil, unless you're going to pay a lot for it up front. So on the left, paying for materials. There are some materials that I bought a couple of weeks ago to build raised beds up at the food forest. A double high raised bed with a support shown, a couple of people making it, and a team we had making a raised bed. So that's like a simple 4x4 raised bed. 2 4x4 raised beds filled with soil will probably cost you about $150 if you do it yourself and you use the methods that we use at Edible Evanston, just to give yourself a budget. So, Julie, I mentioned that lawns sometimes are the best place and have the most sunshine. So are you growing did you convert any lawn?
I did, but I didn't convert. I converted it mostly to a pollinator garden.
Aha.
And then I also threw in some zucchinis. Because you can mix edibles with, flowers. But yeah, I was just interested in feeding the pollinators. So I took up, I got rid of the grass. So.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned mixing, and actually you'll see some photos of what I've done over the last year and a half in the same vein. I started with mostly vegetables, and then some flowers from the beginning, and then I'm working to add both annuals and perennials, but targeted toward pollinators, because hey, those zucchini, although it's really squash bees that most pollinate them, they need pollinators, so attract them with flowers and other food. Mm-hmm. I'm a big advocate of converting lawns to productive vegetable gardens, or for that matter, converting lawns to anything else.
Me too.
I hope I don't turn anyone off here, but lawns don't really add a lot to our world, and they seem to take a lot of resources. So minimize your lawn, maximize the yield you get out in other ways. And it's very easy. You don't have to dig up your lawn and remove the turf. As a matter of fact, please do yourself a favor and don't. So mow it close, that does help. Cover it with cardboard after you remove any plastic tape. Or if you don't have cardboard and you do have newspaper, you can use that. Or during these pandemic times when we haven't been able to use our reusable shopping bags as much, some of us have an awful lot of brown grocery bags. Those work well. Use those to cover the grass. Cardboard will suppress weeds and grass a little bit more than the other two, but not by a whole lot more. So then you want to cover that with compost or leaf mulch or wood chip mulch. And depending upon how much material you have, you can really do it as the term of lasagna mulch is, where you put down a layer of cardboard, a layer of organic material, a layer of cardboard, a layer of organic material, and you will build excellent soil quickly. But it can be hard to have that much good stuff. So this picture had cardboard, which frankly I should have wet down more before I put it down, or wet down more after I put it down, I should say. Then I used some straw that I had. And then basically, unfortunately, all of my homemade compost that I'd had at the time. And initially I bordered it with some wood just to keep it neat and separate it from the lawn. That changed quickly. But I did this on a little bit of an impulse, June 22nd of 2019. So much for planning and observing and interacting. I had observed and interacted. It was not even the sunniest spot in my lawn, but it happened to be the weediest spot in my lawn. And it was at an edge where I felt like, I could remove that and it wouldn't bother anyone.
Well, and this is another reason why fall is a great time to do this, because you can put your cardboard down and everything, and you won't have to wait as long before you can plant it, because by the time spring comes, that area, the grass will be dead and you should have a usable.
That's true. There's a little bit of a trade-off in the now, only because things happen more slowly as it cools down, but that's okay because you're not anxious to do anything. The other thing that I want to point out that you will end up probably having in abundance right now are leaves. And what you may wish to do, and actually I had done in the later pictures, is pile up leaves under or over that cardboard, and they will become part of that organic matter and really help. So you can rake up all your leaves into the area you're going to use, cover it up, and then put your layers down. So this was the sample where at the end of June of 2019, I had put down the homemade compost. By August 15th, I had a big squash plant producing squash, as you see. And at Wright, just about a year ago, was the garden at the end of the season with a 7-foot tall okra plant in the front and the squash and some other things. And those things were actually direct seeded the beginning of July right into that compost. So not even plants, they were seeds put in right then. And this is the kind of result you can get. The area in front where there's a marigold kind of cut off at my photo, I made a mistake. I got impatient and I removed an area of turf and I didn't cover it because I was kind of out of material. That's the one area I get annual weeds because I disturbed the soil. So I do have a bit of a problem with some of the perennial weeds, creeping Charlie and violets coming through. Not really problematic, easy to remove, not a real problem. The annual weeds are a problem. They shed a lot of seeds. So if you don't disturb the soil, you don't get weeds. So about a year ago, I think it was more like November when I finally got started, I expanded that space, doubled it, and I didn't have any more homemade compost. So I did it with some cardboard, some newspaper, some bag soil, and something that was called compost, but was more like mulch that a neighbor had too much of. And I just want to say I put down the cardboard with some leaves and I covered it with some sticks over the winter. I didn't get the other materials down until I think March. So in the far left, there's a bit of a cover crop coming up, and that cover crop is actually shown as part of what's growing in the right, which is fenugreek, for those who know their Indian herbs and spices, methi. And in the middle, the rabbits really went to town and ate the plants I planted, but I had started some things there, and that didn't even have any soil. That was just commercial mulch. So at the right are transplanted in eggplants, sown radishes, and that sown fenugreek in May. This is that space this July. Eggplant and basil bursting out of it. In the picture at the far left, the center picture on the right side of that path is the new little flower garden where the rabbits have gone to town for pollinators, and then the space extended from the year before. So that shows how you can convert a lawn. And I'm not into terribly neat. I have a more naturalistic approach, and I plant very much of a polyculture. So it depends, of course, on your aesthetics. But I think what I ended up with is, in my point of view, is beautiful and is more beautiful than a lawn. So think of it as what can you do with this space? What are your desires? If you just want a few vegetables, if you want it to be in neat rows, fine. If you want it to be a just smorgasbord of flowers and vegetables all together in a mix, go for it. How are we doing, Julie?
If anyone has any questions, please put them in chat. And we will have Q&A at the end too.
Oh, I actually want to go back for a moment. I looked at a couple of my notes. I want to make one comment about leaves. Not all leaves are created equal. The one plant I suggest you avoid using the leaves of is black walnuts and anything in the walnut family. So if you happen to have that, that's not really compatible with most other plants. And so if you don't know how to identify a walnut, I would suggest looking that up. Just making sure you don't have walnut leaves or fruit or bark or anything. And pine and spruce tend not to be the best if you're going to use any of that. Make sure you use it in very small quantities. Pine can be good if you need acid and for blueberries and things like that, but for many plants, that's a bit of a problem. I wanted to give a few little suggestions on soils, because both for the raised bed and for this treatment, where are you gonna get your soil and what are you gonna get? So that sample here with the fenugreek starting, There was some Whitney Farms organic soil from Costco in there. And later on, I think I added a little bit of Dr. Earth compost. Those are both pretty good. They tend to be quite broken down. And you should avoid anything with, as much as you can, with conventional fertilizer already added, and of course, nothing with anything toxic.
Tim, we did have a question that came up in chat.
Mhm.
When you're getting rid of the grass, Annette wanted to know, how high do you pile the layers if you're doing the lasagna method?
Well, hopefully you can get 2 inches of material at a minimum. That'll do it. And up to 6 inches is usable. And I guess one of the things I didn't talk about, I'm sorry to flip back and forth, on the raised bed is what I wrote at the bottom here. The best option might be a raised soil bed without sides. And that's basically kind of what we're talking about here, is about 6 inches high. So while I was advocating not disturbing the soil, one method is, if you need a path along this, would be to dig that path out a bit and pile it where you're going to go, and then do your layers on top of that if you're trying to get some height. And then you can fill that path space in with free wood chips. And that way you kind of have the best of both worlds without sourcing too much material. It obviously takes a little bit more physical labor, but that's where you get about a 6-inch high raised bed. And most market gardeners, most people growing like small vegetable gardens, like the type of people you see at the farmer's market, they are growing in that kind of raised bed. They are making good soil sitting above the ground with paths in between. They're making like a 30-inch wide by 100-foot long bed like that, to grow most of the food you find at the farmer's market.
Tim, also Vivian wanted to know if this is a good time to do the lasagna bed.
Definitely. Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is there isn't really a bad time, but the worst time would have been late this summer when there's just no rain, because to be successful, it needs moisture. And so you'd end up out there with a hose, which is not ideal for multiple reasons, because I'd prefer not to use city water, not only to not use water that somebody had to make all pure and clean, but also because it's got some chlorine residue in it that will not encourage the soil biology that we find so precious. So if you can do it at a time when there's moisture, one of the things this past winter was actually rather unsnowy for a long time and dry. And I had done the extended area for this, and it wouldn't snow, it wouldn't rain, it wouldn't do anything. And finally it snowed, and I went out with a snow shovel and I shoveled the snow from the grass that I frankly didn't care about onto my cardboard to pile it up to get it as wet as possible. So moisture is a big need, but beyond that, do it whenever you can. And yeah, finally it's raining and it's not too cold, so it'll actually start getting going. And once it gets going, it will keep working over the winter for you. So now is an ideal time. All right. And I think the rest of what I was going to say I can add later. So I mentioned that I can leave no land not growing vegetables. Well, I can leave no pavement not growing vegetables also, apparently. And if you only have pavement, you can still grow food. So I didn't have the best photos available, but some options for growing food in paved areas, on patios, and also, as previously mentioned, if you really believe you have contaminated soil and would prefer to grow separated from the soil. My sister lives in the Boston area, and she feels like there's no safe place in her soil. So she's growing just in containers. And even though she has garden space to use. So that's an option. So you can use these methods anywhere. And actually, I do use some of them in lieu of raised beds, even though I have space, in order to get some of those advantages without the material expense of raised beds. So straw bales, fabric pots, self-watering pots, wicking beds, which are a kind of a new trend, but pretty related to self-watering pots. Any other pot you happen to have, and in order to expand your space, trellising. So in the photo on the right, you see a straw bale garden, 3 oat straw bales stacked and turned in such a way that you can plant into the open end of the straw, and in the spring you prepare those by fertilizing them heavily so they start to break down, and then you just plant right into them. You don't have to buy any soil. A straw bale it's not only about $8. I will ask Julie to send a link to everybody. I've got a farmer that I buy my flour from, who is going to deliver straw bales, $8 a piece, by middle of November here to Evanston. And while not certified organic, they are oats grown sustainably without any chemicals. So it's the equivalent of certified organic. Since you're not growing food to sell it, you don't need to be certified. And so those are $8 a piece, which compares pretty favorably to a bag of soil and a container. They're a little tricky. They drain really well. They can dry out quickly. They last either a year or 2. They change over time, and they end up turning into compost and mulch you can use elsewhere. So they're an interesting option. The fabric pots you see, there's gray ones that theoretically don't last that long, although they last forever. And brown ones that last even longer than forever, apparently. And those are made of a combination of materials, including like recycled pop bottles. And they have the advantage of breathing. And then in the foreground, with some lettuce and pansies in it, is a self-watering pot, a kind of traditional self-watering pot. So the challenges of growing food in paved areas are that you do require containers, soil, and more watering. Fabric pots have the advantage of breathing and staying cooler. They drain well, and they allow roots to air prune, which means that they don't wrap in circles. If you've ever grown like a house plant, you've gone to transplant it, or if you buy transplants from a nursery and you take them out, you'll see the roots all matted together. Well, fabric pots avoid that. I use a brand called Root Pouch. And they can be very cost effective. I buy them in sets of 10, and the large sizes are, compared to a hard-sided pot, are pretty cheap. Wicking and self-watering containers tend not to dry out. So they'll take a little less vigilance on your part, and you can make a wicking bed or a self-watering container by using like a big plastic tub to put things in, raised up so that the plants aren't sitting actually in the water, and then put cotton or other natural material cords out of a hole in the bottom into the water, so it'll soak up into the soil as it's needed without the soil getting oversaturated. A trellis can make better use of vertical space. So, and I'm going to read the next thing too. Grouping can create a microclimate. So if you look at the photo on the left, all the way at the left edge, I put a trellis against the wall so that I can grow vertically out of the pots. And I group the pots tightly together so that they don't dry out and respond to the environmental forces on them as much as they would if they were all spread out alone. Do realize that your area can get very hot, like the brick wall. I've got a tomato on it this year that has leaves that got singed, that I trellised up the side, because the sun hits that brick wall in the afternoon and it heats way up, and I actually think I was cooking the tomatoes on the plant. And then if you look at the shadows in the photo, the shadows show that the building is shading all of that stuff all morning long, and then even into the early afternoon at times of the year. So if you've got a paved area, highly likely that you've got structures around it, so it may be harder to get enough sunlight. But if you can move things around either during the day or at different times of the year because they're in containers, that might work. And actually, I visited a house a couple years ago where they had set things up literally on casters so that they could move them around during the different seasons. Any questions, Julie? I can't hear you. You're muted.
No, there aren't any questions right now.
Okay. You got any? All right. Now we'll get to the heart of the matter, to the wonky, techie, nerdy things that will, in my mind, that be the difference between success and failure. And that's soil. And yeah. So what is soil? What's soil, Julie?
Well, I learned in my Master Gardener class that as soon as you bring soil into your house, it becomes dirt because it's not attached to the soil web, which connects it to all the living things. So soil is a living thing. It's got all sorts of things like nematodes in it, and I can't remember everything, but as soon as it's removed, that's why Tim mentioned it can be harder to grow in containers because you don't have all those natural processes. So.
Right. So plants get their energy from the sun, and frankly, every living creature on this planet is dependent upon plants and their magical ability to photosynthesize and turn the sun's energy into something, transform it into matter, and matter we can use. Without plants, none of us would exist. So the sun provides that energy, but all of the molecular building blocks either come from soil, from the carbon dioxide in the air, or from water. So a plant is taking the carbon from the air, using the sun's energy, it turns it into complex sugars, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. And if you if you studied any chemistry in school and you remember organic compounds, you know that it's more than just that makes up those carbohydrates and proteins and oils. And it's got to get that from somewhere, and it gets it from the soil. And we've sort of tried to simplify with what is now called conventional agriculture, but isn't really at all conventional. We've tried to simplify things into being about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and nothing else. But while those three macronutrients are critical for plants, it's not just that. That's not everything. So as Julie mentioned, it's about the biology. It's about the soil food web. It's about bacteria, fungi, protozoa, earthworms, nematodes, beetles, all the things breaking down the organic matter and breaking down the minerals and making them available to the plants in a form they can use. It's about capturing the nitrogen from the air and from the soil and converting that into a plant available form. All of that is dependent upon biology. So we need to make our soil healthy. We need to not kill off everything in it. We need to support those microbes. One really interesting thing about plants, which I've only learned in the last few years, is that they will exude out of their roots about 40% of the energy that they get, 40% of the sugars and other materials that they make out of their roots to feed the bacteria and fungi in the soil and support them, because they, quote unquote, know they get the benefit back of having those critters support them with the things they need. So it becomes a symbiotic relationship. And we want to foster that relationship. We want to help it along. We want to encourage it. And we want those critters to build and break down and transform lots of organic matter. They will create, given enough support, these soil organic matter aggregates. Especially fungi are very important for exuding something called glomalin that holds the particles of soil together with a sticky organic substance, which is good, and creates these little aggregates that create open spaces in the soil. The open spaces are air much of the time, allowing oxygen into the soil to support those critters. It's critical. The plants need the oxygen there, and the bacteria and fungi need the oxygen there. And of course, the nematodes and the protozoas and the earthworms need it. They also need water to get into the soil, and those pores, those soil pores it opens up, allow that. And it allows that water also to travel down through it, so you don't get waterlogged, compacted soil. So a healthy soil is alive with all these things, and they're all working for you.
I was going to add one other thing. Sometimes people think, well, why can't I just use fertilizers? And it's kind of like if you think about feeding your kids, and if you just fed your kids donuts and Pepsi, or Coke or something all the time, they'd get the energy, but they wouldn't be a healthy person. So it's kind of like the soil. You're you want the soil to have a variety, we'll call it food, just for lack of a different word. You know, you need different kinds of nutrients to build healthy soil, just like you need a variety of nutrients to build a healthy body. And a lot of the chemical fertilizers that you use don't really build health. They just provide like a sugar rush.
Well, I was gonna use exactly that same sugar rush example, because what happens after your sugar rush to you?
You
What
just go, you're
you
like,
crash, right? Well,
uh,
and so it's not a sustainable thing. And that's a real problem with fertilizer use, because there's a funny other little feedback cycle that happens with fertilizer use. You give plants the fertilizer, they say, hey, I don't need those critters. They're not doing anything for me. And frankly, that fertilizer you just put in there killed them all anyhow, so there aren't any of them. So I'm not going to exude anything. And then you walk away and stop giving it fertilizer, and the plants go, where's my next meal coming from? Because there's nothing there to support it, because they're not exuding anything. There's no life in the soil. There's nothing to have a long-term stability. There's a trade-off for this, for us as growers. Fertilizer can be this wonderful little short-term happiness, like sugar can be for some people. But it's got the downside of the addiction and the not being a good support, and not really giving you the nutrient dense foods you want either, because those foods need to have all those elements. Where are you going to get them if it's not from your food? And where's it going to be in your food if it's not supplied to your plants? And the reason you're growing food is to create healthy, nutrient dense food for you and your family, and delicious food. So you can get short-term good results, but long-term not so good, and you get absolutely dependent on the chemicals. And that's what's happened to a lot of our commercial agriculture in this country. And I'm going to try not to get on my high horse about it too much, but there's a real reason for understanding how everything works together and seeing it as an ecosystem. And I think, yes. So I say stay away from the chemical fertilizers, and fungicides and pesticides as well, even organic ones if you can manage it. If everything is in balance and you support everything well, and I'm not making, I don't want to make this a panacea. I don't want to say that you'll never have any problems, but if, we get a mild, let's say we get a mild stomach ache because we ate something a little bit wrong. After a day or two, the good biology in our system will take care of that. If you eat a good balanced diet and you support your own microbiome, and I may be getting into stuff that people don't know about. So if you keep your plants and your soil healthy with a diverse group of fungi and bacteria, you tend not to have weak plants that can get taken over by one problem. As soon as you start killing things, you're going to kill some beneficials. So only use that stuff if you absolutely need to. Do not knee-jerk into kill, kill, kill philosophy in your garden. It's a hard lesson to learn, because that's not how our society is set up. So I'm sorry, I'm getting on the high horse again.
I was just going to say, especially with insects, people go crazy about insects. And
right.
80 to 85% are either beneficial or do no harm. So.
Right, and even if they do a little bit of harm, are your plants strong enough and healthy enough to tolerate it? So I can't remember if I had a picture. Yeah, I had a picture of my garden from this year. I found all of a sudden I had a lot of white flies. I wouldn't quite call it an infestation, but I had a lot of white flies. My plants didn't seem to be hurt at all. And I decided I'm going to ignore that. And you know what the best treatment for white flies, they're sort of the type of aphid is? They're a real problem inside in greenhouses and things. They can really take over and they'll suck a little bit of sap out. So if a plant's not strong enough, it'll get hurt. But a strong plant will survive it. And the best treatment is spray it hard with water. Get the little beasties to move along. So that's like not a kill approach. Slow release organic fertilizers and amendments tend not to be that kind of sugar rush diet. They're more like, here's some food for the bacteria and fungi to consume and then feed to the plants later. So that's how that works. And so in moderation, those are necessary and helpful. Remember that as you get a yield out of your garden, you need to give back. So think about that in terms of your balance. So if you're harvesting out of your garden, figure out how to provide a fertilizer, be it compost that was stuff out of your garden from before, or bought fertilizer to feed it back, but it doesn't necessarily need a lot of feeding. So use good compost, be generous with that, pretty generous. There is such a thing as too much, but I'm not going to get into that. Try not to turn or disturb the soil too much. And this is very easy for me to get on my high horse, but it's about, again, that biology, especially the fungi, but also the bacteria. And there's a sugar rush relationship here too. If you've learned about gardening a while ago, or you used to, you might hear about digging or double digging or tilling or rototilling. All those things are quite a bit of soil disturbance. And what happens when you do that is you initially effectively kill a lot of fungi and bacteria. And as those die off, they actually provide a service to the plants because their bodies are turned into plant energy. But hey, where are the new ones coming from? If you just kill them all off, it is not a long-term sustainable thing. You get the little rush and then nothing. Even though it's an organic process, it's not much better. Keep the soil covered with mulches, or better yet, something growing. It's those living roots exuding the sugars that keep the biology happy. Don't smother, drown, cut off the oxygen with plastics and landscape weed barriers.
Sorry, Tim, you look like you're drying out.
I've got serviceberry kombucha here, so.
Okay, have a sip of kombucha. We did get a question about compost versus fertilizer, and I pointed out that compost acts as a fertilizer. And this is a great time to collect your leaves. If you can mow over them, like I have a mulching mower, so I could take the leaves and put them on the sidewalk and mulch them, and then we have one of those vacuum things to suck them up, and I can bag them. And especially if you have the leaves that are in smaller particles, they do compost faster. But you can also use just leaves from your garden, I'm sorry, from your trees. And if you do get them from neighbors, just be aware if your neighbors are using lots of chemicals, like on their lawn and stuff like that, that can be transmitted to the leaves. So if I get leaves from my neighbors, I ask them first, can I ask you, can I take some leaves? Do you use chemicals? So
the one other chemicals trickiness right now is if you've got ash trees being treated by the city or being treated privately. Those are being treated with a neonicotide. So while I really don't want to lose any ash trees, I have very mixed feelings about this because those leaves then are not suitable for anything. And they're probably okay if they're sent off to a big commercial composting facility. So if you put them in your city compost, it'll probably be okay because it will probably break down those chemicals with the amount of heat and biology that they will be exposed to, but I would not use them in your home compost, which is a shame. If you don't know, don't worry about it too much, but if you do know, I would avoid those. I do want to talk, so I talked about the fact that I'm a vegetable gardener. I'm also like into natural habitat and all the other aspects regarding our environment, more than into. So I want to talk about Leave the Leaves for a minute. And just get on my anti-leaf blower, anti-getting rid of leaves high horse, and encourage you to leave the leaves in. And if you have more than you need to compost, I would encourage you to rake them under trees and into beds and leave them actually whole so that they will support pollinators. Moths and beetles and butterflies need to overwinter in them. So keep some leaves, keep all your leaves, keep some leaves whole if possible. Just don't get rid of them. They're a valuable resource. No point in trucking them 50 miles away to have them turned into compost, to have that trucked back, and then having you buy that next year when you need something. You can keep it and not have to pay for it. And if you're using them in your compost pile, if you layer, so leaves, then some other things, leaves, then some other things, you don't need to grind them up. Yes, Julie?
We did get a question from Vivian asking about leaves that have a fungal disease on them. Can you use those in your compost or as a mulch?
I would say you can definitely use those in either way. Maple trees right now are very subject to the black tar spot, I believe it is.
Yeah.
It's not a fungus that is going to affect other plants. They tend to have a one-to-one relationship with different plants. So I wouldn't worry about it. Plus, if you put them in your compost especially, there should be all this competing biology. In some ways, that fungus will help you because it will help break down the leaves faster and turn them into compost. You want to do everything to encourage all sorts of biology in your compost pile. You can use, I tend to pile leaves under trees, not just for the sake of pollinators, but because when I really need them in my compost is in the summer, when I'm full of green leaves and vegetable scraps and everything, and I don't have any browns. So I like to keep them as a carbon source, so I don't have to use like newspaper or egg cartons or something like that as a carbon source, all of which is fine. Go ahead and use it. Try and balance, when you're making compost, try and balance it from greens and browns. There's plenty of resources. I think we have some on our website for making compost. If you don't have a compost pile now, start one. The city encourages, maybe requires you to have a container and a closed container. And I would suggest that if you are saving food scraps so that you don't have animals. I'd also encourage a container with an actual lid that can keep the water out so that you can control the amount of water. You might open it at times or change it when it's getting dry, but you want to have it wet, but not, again, it needs oxygen in there. So if it's soaking wet, it's going to force all the air out of it. It needs to be a balance. And if you use a container, it needs to have airflow. So if you look in the lower left, the MWRD distributed all these free rain barrels a few years ago. Many of them instantly cracked the first season. One that I had did that, even though I tried to make sure it didn't. Many that I found in the neighborhood were set out to be thrown away. And I said, well, there's a container. So if you look carefully, you'll see some like black dots all over it. Those are drill holes. So I drilled lots of holes into that. And that is a primary composter for me. It's got a crack up the back. That's great. Let's air in and out. Let's water in and out. There are holes in the bottom so that there's some ground contact. Next to that on the left is again, found in bulk trash, is somebody's bought composter that they no longer wanted, and I do. The top picture is the simple way of making a frame out of some maybe scrap lumber you have, or a pallet, or something of that sort, and using some wire screening bought at the hardware store, you can keep critters out. So look around, see if you've got, the city had been distributing old trash roll-off bins. Unfortunately, they took the wheels off them, which I don't really know why they decided they had to do that. It makes them much harder to move around. But they did otherwise make, with added holes, they made fine composters. There's no better time to start making compost than now. Whenever now is. It's like, when's the time to plant a tree? Now. When's the time to start making compost? Now. I have a bought little container in my kitchen with a lid, but I used to use like an old coffee can or whatever. So just find a place, a way to store your scraps inside, go out and dump them in your bin every day or two. And then turn it with every now and then. It all depends. The more you turn it, the faster it'll change into compost.
There's lots of resources about composting. So it's we're not going to really get into too much detail about composting, but we have books at the library, and you can find plenty of information on the websites. I highly recommend University of Illinois Extension.
Yes.
For you know, they have scientifically based gardening information. So when you are looking online, it is important to try to find a reputable source of your gardening information. And the land grant colleges, ours happens to be University of Illinois, are all good places to find helpful gardening information.
And there's actually, I wish I remembered the URL right now, but there is a search that you can do on for extensions that searches like all of them at once. But Google will often pull up an extension result anyhow. But yes, all of the state land grant colleges have extension services, and they tend to have the most reliable information. Julie's going to talk about vermiculture. I didn't tell you this earlier, Julie, that picture with the worms there, that's actually not vermiculture. That's my compost bin.
Okay, well, you didn't.
No, the reason I'm saying that is that's what an active compost bin looks like.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about vermiculture, also known as worm bins. They're super easy to make. You can just use a plastic container and drill holes in them. And again, I'm going to refer you to University of Illinois Extension. If you Google Herman the worm, you can get a very easy to understand University of Illinois Extension handout about how to do a basic worm bin. And it will go over all you need to know about keeping flies out or whatever, so you won't have smell, getting your worms, etc. I have a worm bin that I use indoors, and it's a purchased one. But you can also do outdoor ones. People worry that the worms will die in the winter because the types of worms used in worm bins are called red wigglers, and they're not as hardy as the earthworms we're accustomed to seeing. However, I have heard from others, including Tim, that if your compost is thick enough, and it's compost as it decomposes generates heat, that the wigglers, at least some of them, can survive. So anyway, it is easy, and I'll quickly tell you that when I got my worms, I purchased a worm bin, I got it all ready, and then the worms arrived by mail in February. And my son was home sick that day when the worms came, and so I asked him to help me put the worms in their new habitat. And so I said to him, what do you want to call this worm? And he said Calvin, because he was reading Calvin and Hobbes at the time. So he named every single worm Calvin. So I have Calvin and all of his children and his offspring in my worm bin. Anyway, you can buy red wigglers, and believe it or not, they're easily shipped even in February. You can get them on Amazon. You can also ask someone you know, like I have lots and lots of worms that I would be happy to share with a friend. And what they do is the worms break down all kinds of things. I use kitchen scraps, cardboard egg cartons. You can use junk mail, newspapers, all sorts of things, and the worms do their thing. And essentially what you get are called worm casings. But what it really is worm poop. However, that's what worms do in the soil. They break down a lot of the things that are in the soil, and their excrement is essentially fertilizer. So worm bins are really great. We're not going to go into how you do it, but check out Herman the Worm, or just put in vermicomposting in Google. One last comment about finding reputable websites. Look for domain names that are .edu, standing for educational, rather than .com, because .com sites are often trying to sell you things, and .edu come from educational institutions that often do research, etc. So, and also Tim had pointed out that there are wood chips often available from the city of Evanston at James Park. That was one of the questions we had in the chat, was about getting free wood chips. And Tim, I believe you said the city makes them available?
Yeah, so if you drive down the road that goes past the Levy Center, where the Levy Center parking lots are, and keep going to quote unquote Mount Trashmore, where that road right after the last parking lot, before it kind of disappears behind Mount Trashmore, the city has a big pile of wood chips usually, and these days a smaller pile of ground chips. And the lower right corner photograph is those ground chips that I got a couple of weeks ago. So that's what that looks like. So those are partially decomposed. So that's good if you want a broken down mulch, if you want wood chips for a path or other areas that you want, or to grow wine cap mushrooms or something where you want them less broken down. Those are there as well. They've got two different piles, and just bring containers and a shovel and be ready for mess. It's not that messy, actually. It's wonderful.
Let's also, we've hit 8:30, and I'm afraid people may be getting
yes.
need to get going. So if anyone doesn't have any questions about improving your soil, perhaps we could move on.
Yeah. Why you might do a soil test. The big points are that I want to hit here is it can be really helpful to know your soil pH, how acid or alkaline it is. In general, in this area, our soils tend to be a little alkaline, while like in the East Coast, they tend to be a little acid. If it's too much one way or the other, plants won't thrive. One of the reasons plants won't thrive is other minerals become inaccessible. So the goal is to have a 6.5 target. You can send off to a decent soil laboratory and get a report like the one on the right. You can get a soil test at, a hardware, box store, garden store. They can be very hard to do yourself, and pH is surprisingly hard to measure well in soil. So some of the land grant universities will do it, or commercial labs, and then they can be like between $10 and $30 a soil test, just to give you an idea. And of course, you've got to get the soil there, so there's a shipping cost. And in addition to the macronutrients, they usually don't tell you about nitrogen for good reason, because it changes all the time, but you'll get your phosphorus and potassium levels. You'll also get the micronutrient levels, all those minerals that you see, an evaluation of salinity, which can be a real problem with some composts you get that might have lots of salts in them. You can determine if you want the amount of organic matter if you're curious, but just keep building it. By knowing some of this stuff, you can also avoid adding things you don't need. Adding too much of a fertilizer you don't need can be bad for the environment and also bad for your plants, get things out of balance. Like we show a very high level of potassium here, and that can be a little bit of a problem. So we have to make sure not to add any more potassium, or we're going to have an availability problem for other things, because it's very complicated. These things all interact, but the labs are very nice and tell you if you've got a problem or not. The fact that we're low in manganese and very high in zinc is apparent here without our understanding what the numbers are. So a good lab will tell you that, and you will tell them what you're going to be growing, and they will give you recommendations. There are usually, and I meant to look this up if there are any right now, if you think you've got lead, there's sometimes the University of Illinois was teaming up with some other people. You can Google Illinois free lead soil test or something like that to see if somebody's offering it right now, to test your soils for heavy metals if you think that they exist. They're often not included in a basic lab soil test. You have to specially order that. So if you can get a free one, especially if you're concerned about it, go ahead and do that. If I can find a link and I remember, I'll give it to Julie for when she sends the things out for that.
Tim, there was a question about a pH probe, things that you stick in the soil.
Right, I had a pH probe and I found that the answers I got were so erratic that I didn't trust it. Your soil has to be have the right amount of moisture to conduct the electricity from one end of the probe to the other, because really what it's measuring is its ability to transmit a current, and it's reacting to that. And your probe has to be clean. So I would take it out, polish it, have this wet soil, I'd plunge it in, and I'd get one answer, and then I'd try it again and I'd get another answer. And that's when I went, oh, why did I buy this thing? I'm just going to send my soil off to a lab. If you have one, if you already have one, my suggestion would be to take a soil sample, mix a bunch of soil as you do for a proper sample, look that up, save a portion of it, send the other portion off to the lab, find out what they tell you your pH is, measure it yourself, compare. If your results are the same, then trust your probe in the future, and then you can just use that. If they're not the same, I would just send off to a lab. It's for the amount that it costs for a good soil test that tells you everything with the pH versus a meter that is unreliable. And I tried using the strips, the color strips like you did in high school chemistry. And with soil, I found that to be just overly challenging, and I'm not totally hopeless. um, so I hope that answered your question. I'd love to be able to suggest using a probe because that would be the way I'd want to do it. But so since you're trying to start a garden, or maybe you have some space now, it's really important to protect your soil for the winter. Keep your soil covered year round. Protect against erosion and compaction. The biggest factors in erosion and compaction both are rain, those raindrops coming down and hitting soil. So it's not really about how much somebody's walking on it. Just the weather impacts can take care of that. So if you keep it covered with the things that I'm going to discuss, that will help against those. It will also capture and hold on to nutrients, so those don't run off. Keeps the microbiology underneath alive, which is already stated as critical. And then if you can, plant a cover crop or have perennials growing. Either one will work. So if you're interplanting in a flower garden, for example, your perennials will somewhat act as a cover crop by keeping living roots. But around here, a winter kill mix is usually used, so you don't have a problem in the spring, and then a mix of legumes, something in the legume family that fixes nitrogen. I won't get into that, but peas, beans, and vetch, and then some sort of what's called often a nurse crop like oats or rye will help grow in a mix. And a mix has all sorts of advantages for the soil biology anyhow, because those plants have different interactions with the different creatures. And by having a mix, you keep as many alive as possible. In terms of keeping it covered, you can mulch with straw. Again, those straw bales are available for $8. I don't want to be pushing that too much, but I want to at least allow you to know where they're from or where you can get them. Leaves, as Julie mentioned, wood chips from the city, grass clippings from your lawn, especially if you don't, and you won't now ever use chemicals. And then sawdust and wood shavings are a less good option. And I did want to mention a couple of things about horse manure. I've used it in the past. You can go and shovel your own horse manure from the stables, like on Harms by Golf. They have a big pile. They'll be happy if you go and take it away. They can't promise you if they've dewormed those horses, given them other medicines, so there might be pharmaceuticals. They can't guarantee if there were any herbicides used on what they fed to the horses, because herbicides are actually used on some pasture and hay crops in order to kill out certain types of quote unquote weeds, and those can cause a problem. So I used to really want to recommend that, but now I have to hesitate. So use it with caution. Although, wow, it can give you a boost. Never use it on living crops. It would be a good thing to do now, but you never want to put any unfully composted manures, both for human health and for the fact that they will be too hot, quote unquote, and burn, quote unquote, the plants. You really need them broken down by the biology already.
Tim, I have a question. Can you put like manure in your soil now and plant cover crops, or one or the other?
I think I would say one or the other. Yeah, I mean, the horse manure especially happens to be, you know, if you go get it, you'll find a lot of hay that is hardly broken down in it, or straw, because it's actually a mixture of the bedding and the manure. So it's the various excrements along with the bedding. It really needs to break down, and I don't think your cover crop would be successful.
Okay.
So I did want to tell you a little bit about Edible Evanston before our Q&A. I'll race through this because I know we're over time. So we have 4 initiatives: a food forest up on McCormick, produce sharing, growing new gardeners, and education and outreach. Because I'm talking to new gardeners, we do help out a couple. At this point, it's down to a couple of new gardeners a year because we're a little overtaxed and it's all volunteer based. But we've put in about 40 gardens in Evanston and supplied a mentor to teach people to help them out during the first year of growth, to get them over that curve that I started about getting discouraged. So just don't get discouraged, just keep going. But if you know somebody, especially somebody who has need for financial aid in an underserved community, and you feel like they need some training, suggest that they visit our website and apply. We do education like this class. We also distribute free seeds every spring. Hopefully we will be this coming spring again, usually in March at the Ecology Center. We teach classes. The last one was just last Saturday, but March, outside we teach them March through October in the food forest, along with our work and learn programs. So the food forest, if you want to learn about permaculture and how it applies, it's a great way to see an integrated planting of perennials, fruit trees, vegetables, berries, herbs, shrubs, all together. It's all volunteer. The city gave us some space that was just turf, and as you can see, we grow mushrooms and trees and all sorts of things, and it's all dependent upon people helping us. And produce sharing, when you are really successful with the garden you are starting, we have a solution for that overabundance of zucchini, especially the one that you didn't notice that got huge, and the mint that you decided to plant and took over. Bring it all to us, drop it in one of our drop-off locations, and we'll get it to a food pantry. Sharing local produce, teaching people how to grow it is what we're about.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm sorry we went over. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat, and probably Tim will answer it, but I may have to put my 2 cents in.
Julie, do you want to just open up mics at this point to make it
Yeah,
faster?
if people want to open up their mics, that's fine. The reason I'm asking you to keep your video off is because we are posting this on the library's YouTube channel, and we don't want to show your image without your permission. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask Tim a question. 10, 9. Okay, well, maybe.
Is anyone still there?
Yes, there's still some people here. So we'll wind things up. Once I get the YouTube link, I will be sending everyone who participated and or registered to the link to the PowerPoint and the YouTube channel, and also some of the other things that we mentioned today. So thank you for joining us. Again, I'm sorry we went over, but there's just so much to learn and so much to share. I would say that both Tim and I are enthusiastic gardeners. And I will say about myself, not always successful, but I keep at it, and I hope you will too. So thanks for your time tonight. Tim, thank you. And feel free to let others know about this content.
Julie, I just wanted to thank you and the Evanston Public Library for allowing us to do this and reach more people and encourage people to grow, because that's really what's important. And you guys who are still out there, when you're successful, you'll spread the good word and train others. And I look forward to seeing a vegetable garden in every front yard through Evanston so that everybody knows that growing food is good.
Right. Well, thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Good night.